Hello everyone. The video that you're about to watch is a bit different for this channel. I had the absolute pleasure of having a long conversation with Fran Simeoni, head of Radiance Films, previously of Arrow Films, and we had a great discussion. We talked about the future of Radiance as a label, we talked about the industry in general, we talked about our shared love of Italian cinema, so we got into lots of great things. So I do hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. I'll include links to the Radiance Films website and social media in the description of this video. So if you want to check out all of the good stuff that Radiance is doing, then please head over to them. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Hello everyone, it's Elliot here, but I am joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Fran Simeoni. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Anyone who's probably watched some of my videos lately has seen that I've covered Radiance Films and some of the releases and the partner label stuff that you've been doing. But for anyone who's not familiar with yourself, could you just give a bit of a brief rundown on who you are and what you've been up to?
Sure, yeah. I started Radiance Films last year. We're a few months into our first releases now. Our first releases came out in January. We're focused on quite a good range of things. I mean, I, as a film fan, don't just like one thing. So I like all kinds of cinema from different eras and different countries. So, the selections in what we're releasing is very much about my taste. So we've got kind of Palme d'Or winners to sort of slightly more weird and trashy stuff. So it's a nice selection. I'm not doing this for the first time, although it's a brand new label. I used to be director of content at Arrow Films. So I was there for 12 years. So some of the things and types of films and releases that I explored there will probably find their way over to Radiance now. Um, Arrow has sort of had a much bigger remit and sort of much more cult and horror focus. I will be doing a bit of that. I've got horror films coming up for Halloween, of course. Um, so yeah, there will be sort of similar things between the two labels. I'm sure Arrow is now going to evolve under its current stewardship, and Radiance will probably evolve as it goes forward as well. So it's exciting times for physical media fans, I think.
Definitely exciting times. Just touching on your time at Arrow, actually, because that was how I came to know who you are. Because I'd always look at the notepad clues, the hints that you'd give for releases and stuff. Were there any particular releases that you're proud of that you were part of in your time at Arrow?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I sort of had a few go tos that were always sort of very easy to say, and then out of the woodwork, someone will just sort of contact me and say, "Oh, well, this was a great release," and I think, "Oh God, yeah." It might have been mentioned less, but there are loads. I mean, so the one someone mentioned the other day was Decalogue, which I was, quite heavily involved in. I acquired the title, sort of worked closely with Nick Wrigley. Well, I don't know about closely, but I was involved. The looking on the design side of things, which came out, I think, really, really well, and acquired all the sort of short films and documentaries that he made as well. So I was really happy with how that came out, and a monumental, television series. So, of course, that's going to be up there. But there are loads. I mean, I was so fortunate. I kick myself all the time that we sort of managed to get all these great films all the time. Things I never thought would happen, like Out One, from Jacques Rivette, this, which I'd never seen. It only played once in London, and I couldn't go, or I missed it, or whatever it was. And then the chance came up to acquire it, and I was just like, yeah, not even having seen it, which I would never do at Radiance. Like everything that we do, I've seen and sign off on. But that was an exceptional project to work on. And there are loads like that, things that we took that were sort of undiscovered, or, in need of rediscovery, like the Borowczyk films. Very proud of Borowczyk set. Um, People were discussing the Taviani set recently as well, another absolutely brilliant one. Unfortunately, never sold very well, but just brilliant films. Yeah, I mean, we did loads of great Italian stuff like that, and Tree of Wooden Clogs, another phenomenal film. Salvatore Giuliano, another one that didn't sell very well, but just brilliant films. People should seek them out. They're great.
Most of those that you just mentioned, I discovered for the first time through those releases. And one that I used to always champion on the channel years and years ago is the Poetic Trilogy, the McMalbath release, because that was one that was a real discovery for me. But I got to imagine that one wasn't hugely popular at the time as well.
It was okay. It was okay. I mean, I think it did better than some of the ones I just mentioned. Partly because the costs are sort of on the lower side, and again, something about them just made them connect a bit better than the others. But basically, kind of small potatoes for Arrow. Really, it was sort of like, this new 4K is a lot sexier and exciting, and it gets more people fired up. So there is an element of that. It's a team effort. It's not just. I've always said that. People say, "Oh, what's this of yours?" Blah blah blah. And sometimes I feel a bit awkward sort of saying it because plenty of other people put so much work into them, or did probably more than me, really, and um, and all of that feeds into the way the whole company or any company would work. I expect because it is a team putting these things together. It's not just a one man band, and it's entirely down to that person's whims essentially. So there's lots of considerations there.
And even now with Radiance, you've got quite a team that you're putting together now, like some of the people that are involved.
I'm lucky in that I'm much freer now to sort of pick and choose people for projects. I don't have a full time team, so I can go to people that I know and sort of say, "Do you want to work on this? I know you're a fan," or sometimes it's just chatting with people and it's like, "Okay, let's do this," and that's great. So it's nice to have sort of different people involved in different projects, um, and it keeps things varied and puts the expertise in the right place, basically.
So you must be happy with the success that Radiance has seen already in just the first few months, because everyone I know who is into collecting, boutique Blu-rays has been talking about Radiance.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, in the planning stages to sort of know. You know, I think that's probably evident if you look into it with some of the numbers. Some 2,000 unit limited editions, might have seemed a bit low, but when I was doing all the planning, I was thinking, well, how much is my name going to mean anything to anyone? And take me out of Arrow, it might mean nothing. So um, I was a little bit cautious, but then the market is sometimes a bit of a strange beast. I didn't expect Working Class Goes to Heaven to sell out at all. Nothing like the speed with which it sold, um, and and then when that was really flying, it was just amazingly gratifying, and it gives me confidence for more releases like that, certainly. But then there are other things that sort of think, oh, God, how's this going to do? So there's definitely been surprises, but it's on the whole, it's been um, really, as I say, gratifying and surprising, really, that this kind of support and enthusiasm that's been around the company, around the label so far has been great.
And it seems like it's the right time for you to do this kind of thing. Why do you think it's done so well now rather than if you'd have done it 3 years ago or 3 years from now?
Yeah, I do think you're right in that the timing is quite good. I think the thing is now is that it's become a very sophisticated marketplace. I mean, I used to say this back at Arrow, I'd say, things are going to become more niche because we know the market's going down. We know it's getting smaller, and when Twilight Time started doing limited editions, it was sort of a bit mad when they first started. You sort of think, oh, you could sell way more than that. But in a way, they were sort of looking further ahead than any other label. And arguably, things may end up where they started, things just being that one run and then that's it. And I may do things like that. I've already sort of got plans to do things like that because there are things that are sort of so niche or risky that you sort of say, well, I can only do a deal for just this one run, or there's only the ability to do that, and that in turn means that labels can be more adventurous, and that I think brings out a different kind of fandom. And I think that's certainly given me confidence to start with things like Big Time Gambling Boss, which nobody had ever heard of, or A Woman Kills, which is just an unclassifiable, completely unknown you know thing of its own, really. Um, you couldn't have done that 5 years ago. It just wouldn't have really worked. But now I think the customer sort of profile of the audience is sort of matured so much that people have been through the usual suspects, as it were, and are now sort of hungry for more, or you know that fandom is developed, and it's just about accessibility. Whether it's more labels or more websites or YouTube channels like this, kind of improving and giving better access to that knowledge, basically.
That's always something that I'm big about, is improving accessibility for these films, because sometimes if you look at art house films or films that aren't in the English language, there can be a bit of a stigma towards first approaching watching films like that. So I'm always trying to, get as many people into these films, and in a way that's what you're doing with Radiance, because
Mm.
90% of what you've announced I'd never seen before. So in that way you're helping get me into these films as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that was always something in the back of my mind, in that Radiance is the kind of label that you do sort of need to have done the kind of basics. You need to have, bought a bunch of Criterions or a bunch of Arrows or a bunch of Eureka or whatever, and then got to that point where you're saying, well, that was really cool, but where's the next thing that's like this, or where does this thing develop from? And I think invariably it's probably a Radiance release, or another sort of more adventurous label, whether it's an Indicator or a Mondo Macabro, or some of the sort of slightly rarer stuff that Kino will release. So in a way, it's fun, I think, for the audience, because you get to explore, using all these different labels as kind of stepping stones to discover, all these different kinds of cinemas, which is cool, I think.
I guess in a way, these films that you're releasing, you are the champion in a way. You're championing these films, because if someone's watching Big Time Gambling Boss now, they're probably watching it on the Radiance disc. It's unlikely they're watching it any other way. So do you feel any pressure, being the kind of the label that is in charge of these films, so to speak, for this time at least?
Um, Not pressure for that reason. I mean, I can only do what I can do in terms of making the accessibility clear and getting it out there. Um, I think the pressure then becomes where people experience one thing and they say, "Oh, I really like that, so I'm going to try it." So if I really like Big Time Gambling Boss, I'm going to try Yakuza Graveyard, and I think that is a bit difficult because they're not alike. Yakuza Graveyard is a different film to Big Time Gambling Boss. So I think in the early days where people are sort of trying to look for connections within the releases themselves and sort of say, "Oh yeah, I'll take a chance on this now," and then for people to get there and say, "Oh, that didn't meet my expectations, and now my confidence is knocked." So that is a bit of pressure, because it makes me look at how to sequence the order of things, and I don't kind of want to do the same thing over and over again. The opening year really of Radiance is going to be a lot of variety, and I think that's kind of by choice. I'm sort of looking more into year two now, and happily, I think I'll be able to keep the variety really going. So I hope people sort of keep the confidence that they can keep exploring and not kind of get knocked when something isn't like the last thing, although it may seem it perhaps. So that's going to be an interesting ride.
For me, it's exciting anyway, even if there would be particular films that might not hit me in the same way as others. The fact that you've got, the extra features on the discs and you've got the booklets, they can provide context to that filmmaker or that country or genre. It's not just necessarily about the one film. So for me, that's what I love. I find that aspect really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my favorite things, really. I mean, I love it when you can get a package that allows you to explore, not just the film or maybe the era or the filmmaker, but perhaps even more than that. And I really got to go into the deep end on Red Sun actually. That has got an extra, which is 50 minutes long. We call it a visual essay. I mean, that's just because of the format in which it was made, but it ended up just becoming massive, and it's like a 30-year history, 30 plus year history. No, about 30 years. So don't oversell it. Of the new German cinema, and I mean the scope of it is massive in terms of the filmmakers. It covers about not a film a minute, but close. 50 odd films are in there. Um, you could just sit there with a pad and end up with a massive, list of things to work through. So it's really exciting, and it covers things that I've never seen discussed anywhere. These things don't have releases at all. I mean, we even struggled to find stills. So to see these things have a light shed on them is was amazing. And I love the fact that you can dip into that and learn a whole era of filmmaking just from one disc. It's one of the things I like to do the most, really. And I'm trying to do that on as many discs as possible. Maybe not always as ambitious, but I think finding out about the context in which a film was made or the impact that it's had is the sort of most exciting thing that you can discover, really.
I'm very excited for that because it reminded me when you were just saying that of when I was getting into cinema. One of the ways that I would discover new films is I'd watch things like, those documentaries that Scorsese did on Italian cinema and American cinema, and I would sit there with a pad, and every time one would come up, I'd be like, right, noting that one down, finding out where it's available and stuff like that. So I'll probably be doing that again with the Red Sun release for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't thought about those for a long time, but yeah, I mean, I suppose that's effectively the inspiration. And then those documentaries that were made about the national cinemas in the late 90s, they're quite similar. I mean, they're not all made in the same way, but I've seen a few of those, and they do a similar job. Um, and yeah, the more of that, the better, really. I kind of wish more filmmakers of Scorsese's kind of stature would do that kind of thing. We don't have a Videodrome or sorry, a Moviedrome or any kind of good programming like that anymore. So I think it is great when labels are able to kind of do that kind of thing.
Yeah. Why do you think that is that there isn't that kind of programming? Because Moviedrome, I didn't watch at the time. I was a bit too young, but I've gone back and watched, everything I can because I love Alex Cox and just hearing him talk about movies. But why do you think there isn't that kind of thing on TV or even online these days?
I mean, the BBC haven't really got an excuse because they shouldn't be commercially minded. So they should just be doing it, from a cultural um, point of view. So I don't know why they're not doing it. But I mean, I think it just doesn't get enough people excited. It's the same, a bit like what I was talking about with Arrow. You're doing something with a bunch of people involved, and you need to get all of those people or as many of them excited as possible. And unfortunately, the industry is kind of full of people who are only interested in the latest thing. I mean, I've worked with big, huge studios, people across all different kinds of areas of the industry, and unfortunately, most people have a passing knowledge or passion, let's say, for film. Not classic film, for film. Um, and unfortunately, I think that doesn't help matters where you've got a commissioning editor somewhere who sort of says, well, who wants to know about old films? And unfortunately they're probably right, in that this is a niche interest, and not many people care. So I think unfortunately that's the reason. Our interest in culture is waning.
Yeah, and with attention spans as well, people just don't seem to have, the interest in sitting down and watching even a movie that's an hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Scorsese documentary. I mean, that's like 4 hours long or something. And the Italy one, I think, is like 3 hours long.
Some of my favorite films are on the longer end of things. Like Barry Lyndon is 3 hours long. So trying to get friends to watch those kind of films is a real struggle.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Which is, a bit silly in today's culture when people will happily binge a series for 5 hours, but when it's a film, suddenly it sort of becomes daunting. But I agree. I love a long film that you can just get into, and you can sit in the world and become totally immersed in it. And long films are much more able to do that because they can take their time and really immerse you. Essentially, there are countless examples.
So we talked a bit about some of the titles you've been working on in Radiance and some that have already been released. Are there any countries or film movements or genres that you've particularly enjoyed working on, or perhaps ones that you really hope to work more on in the future of Radiance?
There are ones I hope to. Definitely, I would like to do more from France. There are loads of French films on my list, basically, and that is a bit of a struggle. I mean, I think the difficulty is that a lot of French companies are a bit stuck in the past, and they make it a bit difficult to sort of do certain things, especially for labels that have an interest in this area, sort of more looking at the kind of big hitters, the big auteurs. You're going to see the Bressons and the stuff like that, where the Truffauts, you can turn these things over and over again. But getting those companies to sort of see that the market is limited for filmmakers no one's ever heard of, which is what I'm interested in, is a lot tougher. So I hope I can kind of break down those barriers and do more from France, which just seems like such a no-brainer because France is such an accessible country for audiences. France doesn't really scare people off in the way that maybe Greek cinema does, although I would like to do Greek cinema. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's stuff from everywhere really. I mean, I'm open to all sorts really because I think there isn't. I mean, not that I've come across so far, but I don't think there's any country that's got just bad films. That everywhere's got good stuff, um, and I'm after the good stuff. So yeah, no, I'm really open to anything, but it has to come down to business practicalities, and sometimes that is what is stopping things more than anything else.
I was going to ask you actually, because I have heard that sometimes negotiating these contracts or licenses can be a bit difficult. I mean, has it been quite difficult so far with the titles that you've acquired, or has it been quite smooth in times?
It's all been fine. I mean, I'm lucky in that I've been doing this a long time, so I don't really have any trouble because I'm not reinventing the wheel. So I know pretty much everyone I've dealt with, known them all for a long time. Um, so that's all fine. That's as expected. Essentially, some things take longer than others. Some of my Japanese deals have taken longer than expected. So there's more Italian stuff coming out this year than I would have liked. I wanted to have a bit of a better mix, but the Italians are much more easygoing. So there's going to be much more Japanese stuff next year, which is fine by me as long as it all comes out, and that is coming, and that's really exciting as well. But no, not really. I mean, deal making is kind of fairly established, in the broader sort of sections of the industry. What's challenging, I think, sometimes is when you're outside of the norm, and that is maybe you're dealing with somebody who isn't licensing every day. Maybe they're more focused on making films, and they've always had someone else do it for them. And I had this late last year where I had a film, one of my absolute favourite films of its era, of its kind, and we found the original production company, and we're negotiating with them. And then we had this person's boss come in at the last minute, who's actually like the company owner, the producer. And that they came in, they said, "Oh, we're used to this, we're used to that." And I sort of had to explain to them, that's what you would do with an agent. We've cut the agent out, so you need to see it from the end point. And they couldn't really grasp that. And then they changed their mind at the last minute, and then the whole thing fell apart. Um, that is not common, fortunately, but it does happen here and there, and that's really frustrating, especially where you've sunk months of time into, developing a release and a relationship and a contract and so on, and then just turns to nothing, and that is really frustrating.
That's a shame. Yeah. Yeah, I think I heard you talk about on another podcast or discussion about at Arrow when you were contemplating Bollywood cinema and modern Indian cinema, and I think you said something like they weren't necessarily used to the usual process for negotiating contracts, so it's a bit harder when the framework isn't there within the industry to get some of those titles.
Well, I mean, with the Bollywood stuff, I've only ever had negotiations with one company, and that was on a new film. But for sort of any classic Bollywood stuff, it's really difficult because they're kind of a cottage industry unto themselves. They don't, as far as my experience goes, they don't really overlap with the industry in the way that all the major US studios or the the bigger indies and retail and all of that kind of stuff will operate in the UK, or even to my knowledge the US, because they've got their own methods of selling. They're selling direct to people like Netflix, or they're not even doing any physical releasing. You won't find like any Yash Raj films in HMV, for instance. So there's no real crossover. So to find people who have worked with them or can make an introduction, or to even get them and do your own homework and pose a deal, it's just going to be completely out of their remit and interest. So that's really the challenge on that side. Um, and from what I understand, in terms of people I've spoken to who have worked with like Indian labs and stuff in terms of material, um, that is not a good situation either. So a lot of the material's just sort of been left, not climate controlled, not being stored properly. So a lot of it's probably degraded in quite a bad way. So even if you manage to do the deal, you could potentially be faced with, a real headache restoring.
Because that all adds to cost, doesn't it? And at the end of the day, you've got to say, can you justify putting in the work, for a limited release? It might not be worth it at all, sadly.
All my restorations currently, we've got 3 or 4 planned this year, and they're all pretty simple. We know the material, we've seen examples of it already, and it's going to be pretty simple stuff. I mean, practically restored. The case is closed, forget it. Sort of received a sort of HD master, but it was like a graded scan. It was really dirty. It had scratch marks, and some things were a bit tougher to fix than others. Um, but that's when you've got that, that's starting at 6, and you want to get to 10. With an Indian situation like I've described, from what I've heard, you'd be starting at like sub-zero. You've got to find reels and mag tracks and stuff, and God knows if it's all there. So that's really tough going.
You mentioned before when we were talking about different countries and things that you're all about finding the good films from places. How do you go about discovering new films and things that you might want to acquire in the future?
I mean, there's no sort of method. I'm doing different things all the time. So sometimes it's reading up on a subject. Sometimes it's just poll results from the Sight and Sound. Sometimes it might be like, oh, what's that? Or looking into one thing and then just going down a rabbit hole and finding something else. And it's a constant discovery. It's just down to research basically, and talking to people, whether they know it, what do they think about it, have they seen it recently as well, because that's the thing. You can look at reviews and someone will say, "Well, this is like an okay film," and then you watch it now and you say, "Well, this is great. What are you talking about?" It's just something you may not have appreciated at its time, or something that was appreciated is now a bit old hat. It's just something. Well, this is just not very interesting. So, um, that's why I say I watch everything, because you can't make those assumptions. You can't look at old reviews and say, "Well, this is revered, so we should definitely do it," because you look at it and say, "Well, it's boring," or "I just didn't connect with it," or whatever. It might not sit right. There is a film that I'm looking at the moment, that no one had a problem with when it came out, but these days might be a bit controversial. I've kind of talked to a few people and trying to get a read on it, and everyone has sort of said it'll be fine, go for it. But that's something I have to look at carefully, because it is different now to what we were doing, even 5 years ago. This with all the issues we'd have with sort of various things going on. I don't want to leave any clues, too many clues, in case it doesn't happen. But that's a big consideration. So it needs to be taken seriously.
I mean, the good thing is you can provide as much context as you want in the release itself to talk about those kind of issues. Because I know that, I think it was a few years ago when Indicator were releasing the Fu Manchu cycle films, and there was a discussion then about whether it's appropriate to bring that out at that time. But I think, they explained, its place in history and the context of it and things.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. You just got to do your due diligence, and you know, you can't rewrite history. I mean, that's always my view, and it's sort of like, I don't want to be suppressing culture, but I don't want to have a difficult time over it either. So, you know, ultimately, if I think the film is worthwhile, and it's got to be a good film, it's got to have something to it. Um, and good is highly up for debate, because some people will think something is good and other people won't. So yeah, it's, as I say, got to be taken seriously, and that's something we're definitely doing.
I mentioned right at the top of this conversation the partner label stuff that you've been doing. So the Fun City Edition ones, which I've got here, and I absolutely loved both of these ones. How did that come about? And a following question to that is, why hadn't this been a thing before this? For other labels in the UK, I don't think it's been a thing in the UK at all before yourself and Radiance.
I mean, I don't think anyone's particularly set up for it, but this was something I was always keen on. So I'm good friends with the guys at Second Run, and I brought Second Run over to Arrow for us to handle their sales. Um, and then that developed, and a few more labels came on board that I wasn't that closely involved with. And around that sort of time, I was sort of saying, well, we should be looking to grow this, and we should have other stuff, because if you look at the retail landscape, we don't have anything like as many retailers as we used to. So people are increasingly shopping direct with labels, and if they're shopping direct, then it makes sense to have a few things in one place. It's easier on the consumer if they can buy their Second Run and Arrow and Third Window and so on all in one place. I mean, that's just kind of a no-brainer. So I wanted to do it then, but a few ideas I had just didn't come off. So I've been able to do it now. So that's why it's coming. But it's been an old idea, just could never get off the ground. Um, as to why no one else has done it, I mean, I guess they're focused on their own stuff. I mean, for me, the reason with these titles, particularly with Fun City, which is where it started, was because I wanted to do both of those titles that you just held up. I wanted to do Cutter's Way and Married to the Mob, films I like a lot. And they were going to be Radiance releases. And when I was looking into them, I spoke to Jonathan, because I'd got wind that he'd done them or was planning them. And I sort of said to him, look, there's no point me doing them. You've done them. And I was planning the third party labels thing, the hosted labels. And I said to him, "Do you just want a partner, and I'll present Fun City in the UK." And that led to Walking the Edge, and maybe we'll see more stuff. And the whole thinking behind it was that the market for the most part is becoming, very globalized. And I don't think it's uncommon for people to, maybe they're not buying, but they are aware that releases are out. They're aware that Fun City have got releases out, that companies in Australia have got interesting stuff, and so on and so forth. Um, and my thinking behind that was my own view as a customer. I'm aware those things are coming out, but I'm not always buying them. I don't actually import a great deal, um, mostly because I'm too busy and lazy, and I don't want to pay all the postage and import fees. So I sort of thought, I bet there's lots of people like me, who look at a certain race and think, well, great, I'd love to have that, but I'm not paying 30 quid for it. So I just sort of thought, well, let's do it the sort of official way, and cut out the postman basically. And I think a lot of people see the logic in that, going by the sales. I think labels do worry that imports are going to kind of ruin their business and so on. But I've always sort of maintained that the people who talk about importing online it's a pretty small number in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I think it's a lot of the same people posting on different forums and social media platforms for a start anyway. Um, but if you bring it to a local market, essentially, then you're going to tap into the people who aren't even aware that this stuff exists. And I think that's who it's for mostly. um, and for those people, like I say, who just may not want to fork out the postage. I mean, for me, I'd rather buy two releases and not pay postage than one, and oftentimes that is what you're going to be getting with these releases. So that was to me an absolute no-brainer, especially where, and what I've been able to maintain so far, um, is releases that feel sort of a piece. There isn't anything that we've done as third-party label, as a hosted label, that I think anyone's going to go, oh, this doesn't fit in here. Um, so I think that's good. It's kind of want to be curated to a point across the board. Including all the hosted labels. Um, so yeah, that's something that is the smaller part of the business for sure. I mean, I'm very focused on the Radiant slate at the moment, so there's not a lot more third party stuff coming, because the Radiant slate's getting bigger. So I need to put my energy into that. But I did agree another label, which I've been chasing for years, and that's exciting. So hopefully that's all going to happen. They're a bit slow, but hopefully it will come this year.
So I want to talk next about a release that's upcoming. I want to talk about The Bride Wore Black, because this is one that I'm very excited to watch, because I haven't seen this one yet, and I consider myself quite a fan of Truffaut and Hitchcock, so it sounds like one that I'm going to enjoy. How excited are you for this particular release?
Well, it's hard to sort of put a level on it. I mean, I'm excited about all the releases. I mean, I'm a big Truffaut fan. I mean, aside from maybe one or two films, I've pretty much enjoyed all of his work, and I've seen all of them. And I like a lot of people, I expect, didn't get to these MGM Truffaut films for a long time. Um, and a few years ago, I just sort of said, sod it, I'll just buy all the DVDs. So I bought all of them. Because I think, like a lot of people, there's things that you haven't seen, you think, oh, yeah, I'll just hang on for the Blu rays. This didn't ever seem to be coming. So I thought, sod it. And I really enjoyed all of them. MGM sort of did quite a bunch of them. And that just kind of went in the back of the mind. And then, when I started reading, so I thought, oh, let's do Bride Wore Black. It's a great starter for people who haven't seen, any of these films, and it's great. I mean, I think where I've naturally sort of gone, not perhaps consciously, but I've gone into kind of art house meets genre, and I think this does kind of fit that bill. It's like new wave Kill Bill essentially. She's got a list of people she has to kill, and she's going around picking them off basically, and it's a lot of fun. It was a big hit for Truffaut. It was, as Kent Jones says in his interview, he basically he needed a hit, and it was his own production company, and he needed to put some money in the company coffers, and it did the job. And it is fun. I mean, it's not a film that he was very happy with. I think he didn't have a good experience making it. I think he was a bit unhappy. He clashed with his DOP, so that didn't help. He sort of thought afterwards it should have been black and white, um, and he had sort of other things with the way he was directing the actors and stuff. So there's sort of on-set drama, but you don't really see it in the film. I mean, I think the film's underrated and a lot of good fun. I'm excited for people to check it out. I think it's one of his good ones for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Truffaut was a big part of lifting up Hitchcock into kind of a critical lens in many senses. And I think in turn, that was probably a big part in the genre cinema that would follow, in Italy with the Gialli and stuff. Hitchcock might not have been as popular if it weren't for Truffaut and, the big interview and the book and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, we're really lucky actually because we're able to reprint quite a few letters in the booklet, and there is correspondence with Hitchcock, and that's really fascinating. Um, yeah, that's a good read.
And I'm also very excited for the Franco Nero box set, Cosa Nostra, that's the first box set, isn't it, that you're doing?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you feel about going into that? The first box set of the label.
I'm excited. I'm glad to get a box set out. There is sort of a bit of trepidation. It has to sell so that more box sets can follow. So there is a bit like, okay, am I going to kind of track well enough to be able to do that? So I'm constantly going back and forth on the box sets as to how to present them. But I'm really excited about this for a number of reasons. I mean, not only is it the first box set, but it was great to have this kind of scope to work with across 3 discs, to be able to split extras, and the book was just sort of kept growing and growing. I mean, when we announced it, it was announced as 80 pages, and I sort of thought, yeah, we'll be around that, if we have to tweak or whatever. And the way that I'm doing all the Radiant stuff is not anything like I used to do it. It was all very controlled and measured, and now, rightly or wrongly, haven't got any discipline. So I'm always just like, oh, let's just do this, or maybe this would be good. Let's just do that, and that's how you end up with a 120-page book when you're supposed to have 80. But I'm really pleased with the book. There's lots of good stuff in there, and I kind of feel like the whole release has no stone unturned. And it was great to get into Damiano's career and do the various bits that we did, on him and about him. And for my own sense of discovery, to move on from that and look at what Damiani is coming up next, and how we work on that, and that's really exciting. As we were saying earlier, getting to explore these different areas of cinema, and Damiani is definitely part of that. He was this filmmaker, very much doing his own thing, and people will sort of find out in the extras, which I think is fascinating. It has been for me, in how he sits, this kind of turning point essentially for Italian cinema. That you had like Francesco Rosi, another filmmaker I massively admire, who was doing these kind of more political, investigative films in the 60s. And then we had Elio Petri following that, but slightly more baroque, and slightly more surreal. And then you have Damiani following them, and he's also still political, but sort of going slightly more genre. And it's fascinating to track that, to follow that trajectory, which I'd never really thought of. And then Mike Malloy talks about how this is like the formation of the Poliziotesco, and that you have Damiani is like I say, this turning point where you had these earlier films, but then you had the sort of more action oriented films that followed, and it was very much a crossroads when his films came out in terms of producers looking at how things worked and coming up with the formula, because it did very much become a formula for those films. So it's fascinating to see that, but also if we're just talking about him, just his films and his concerns, and how he went continually back to the mafia, and what was really fascinating for me for How to Kill a Judge was how much his own personal life became a part of that film, because we see that earlier in his career, where much like the film, a real life event was affected by film, and he kind of brought that into the film himself. And I think that was a film where he was sort of really meditating on what he was doing, the impact his films are having. So I think looking at it, as I have done many times, with those eyes, just becomes even more fascinating. You get this other layers of the film, which is something before all the research, I was just completely unaware of. I mean, that was the first Damiani film I saw years ago. So I think that's the great thing about all these extras. You just get to peel back all these layers.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be a real discovery for many people, and I'm sure it's going to be a success. The first box set. Also, sticking with Italian directors, Dino Risi is someone who I've only seen Il Sorpasso, but in terms of Italian comedy, I mean, classic director, but one whom, like Damiani, might not be talked about much when you talk about the Italian classic directors.
Yeah, I mean I feel really sort of lucky in a way because I didn't sort of do this on purpose, but and it just sort of gives me confidence as well. But every time I have a project and I'm going to people saying, "Are you interested in this?" or "I know you've written about that," or "Would you like to do this?" People say, "Oh yeah, Damiani, oh Risi," and people come back and they say, "This is a great unsung master," and I think, "Oh yes, the more people that say that, the more chance I've got." But I'm not deliberately picking these, unsung masters. It's just the films that interest me. But that does help, obviously. But Risi, the Commedia all'Italiana box set was a very different beast when I started. I was explaining this to someone who's doing an extra for us, and what I wanted to do with that was I wanted to survey a bigger survey of the genre, but unfortunately, some of the films that I really wanted aren't available. It's a company that just doesn't license basically, and they're sitting on a few key texts essentially, and then another one or two don't have good restorations. So it ended up being a Risi set because that's kind of what we got left with. But I do hope there'll be more volumes as we tackle those issues because the titles needing restoration could definitely happen. And I would like to continue to survey the Commedia all'Italiana because it's such a fascinating genre. It's not announced yet, but basically I talk about it in the series blurb essentially that this genre was one that was trying to distinguish itself from the stuff that had come before. People might think about Italian comedy as being like cheesy rubbish, essentially, like Totò films, which never translated to England or to English speaking territories. And they're not like that. I mean, the films are much darker. They have their own kind of investigation in as well, to reference an earlier conversation, in which they were definitely challenging social, ways in which people were living, in terms of like the honor killings and all that sort of stuff around Pietro Gerami's films like Seduced and Abandoned and Divorce Italian Style. That was a very real thing that was still happening in the 60s, and that was something that was being quite seriously addressed. And like we saw Passo and like La Grande Guerra, another one, and even Big Deal Madonna Street, there wouldn't always be these very happy films, despite being comic and for being funny as well. It definitely had a darker undertone, which I find absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I must have learned a lot more about history, world history, through films than I ever did at school or reading books. Like it really is eye opening to learn, the situation people were in at the time of making the movies, and just what things were like. Totally, eye opening in that regard for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving in a different direction now. This was something I was wondering. Are you much of a collector of Blu-rays in general? Because I imagine you're probably quite a busy guy with running the label and stuff. Do you get much of a time to like check out what other labels are doing? See what kind of things are going on in the industry.
I do, yeah. I mean, I get quite a bit. I don't always get time to look at them in as much depth as I would like. I have things sitting. I've got Blu-rays absolutely everywhere. I mean, that's my problem.
Yeah, me
Is
too.
that I don't really cultivate a collection probably like normal people. I've got like Blu-rays stacked up around my desk. You may be able to see there's Blu-rays over there. I mean, that's like all work. That's all work Blu-rays. It's like not my collection. That's just stuff I want to watch or I'm watching for research purposes or things I might release. It all just kind of gets bundled onto this shelf. And then I've got loads in storage, and then I've got my normal shelf. So my collection isn't sort of like, yeah, what anyone might call normal. But no, I am a fan. It's why I do this. My career didn't start in home video. I started in a cinema company, and I thought I was going to go down the new release side of things, and um, was doing that for quite a few years. But I always had the niggle of great Blu-ray or DVDs at the time, and Masters of Cinema were like my label of choice back then. That was what I was thinking. More people need to do this. This is awesome, and eventually made the transition. And having worked on both sides of the industries, I wouldn't go back. This is by far more exciting to me than new release. I do like new releases, but this is that bit more special, I think.
Do you ever struggle, like when you're talking to so-called normal people who don't collect, explaining what it is that you do and the collecting and having all these discs around? Like, do you ever find it hard to explain why it is you do this? Because so many people I know, friends and family, just don't get why I still buy these discs.
Um, I mean, it's hard to explain. I think a lot of people don't understand why or how it works. You do sort of get comments like, "But isn't everything on streaming?" And you just sort of think, "Oh my lord, where do you even start with that?" But I tend not to bother, to be honest with you. I just sort of, I just simplify it as much as I can and relate it to any other product. I mean, essentially, that's what it is. I sort of say, if you work in this kind of industry, you've got physical products, and that's essentially what my business is. It's the same kind of thing, really. Um, I think people do find it impressive though when they see the shelves. I think, wow. And I've got a lot of books as well, and they're all kind of together. So um, people look at it and they say, "Oh wow, this is amazing." And I don't think that's going away. I think a lot of people, the fact that people find it impressive, um, I think is what's going to keep it going. We had this vision at one point that we were going to be, completely minimalist, like 2001. But I don't think anyone really wants that. I think people want stuff they can access for one, but two, it's an extension of their personalities. It's why people have stuff. When you see, these kind of minimalist show homes or apartments or whatever, it's always depressing, I think.
I like to think that if someone was to come in and look at all the films I've got, they could, deduce something about who I am or what I like and, things like that. I think going back to when collecting started in antiquity and people would collect art and things like that, it was to kind of convey who they are, what their ideals are, things like that. So I like to think that it doesn't just look like a big pile of stuff in my house.
Well, I mean, going back to antiquity, it will be the stuff that becomes more valuable than anything else. I read this great story that there was this, I think it was like a stately home or whatever the equivalent was back then. This is going back hundreds of years. And there was this great furniture maker called Chippendale who made all the furniture for the house. And all this furniture became so valuable, it ended up becoming more valuable than the house itself. So, it shows you there's value in stuff.
That's a complete tangent, but that's why I like watching Antiques Roadshow, because I'm always like, what is someone going to bring, that could be worth so much? Maybe we'll see a Blu-ray on there one day.
What we always used to sort of say was it's amazing how with hardbacks and paperbacks that you have a real distinction, and that never really became a thing with Blu-rays, even between sort of limited editions and standards. That there isn't a sort of widely recognised difference. And one of the things I wanted to do for sure with Radiance was to have first edition and second edition printed on the box. So the standard editions do say second edition. So I wanted there to be that little bit for the collectors.
I also collect books, and kind of like an analog to collectible Blu-rays is the Folio Society. Have you ever
Yeah,
heard of them?
yeah, yeah.
Like they do great editions, and they've been going since the 50s, I think. And some of the really early ones are worth a lot of money.
No, indeed.
So to close out the conversation, I wanted to bring up the announcements. You got announcements coming April 5th.
Yeah, next week.
How excited are you for these new announcements? And is there any little drop of whatever that you could kind of hint before next week's announcement?
I'm excited for these announcements. I mean, I'm really pleased with how these releases have turned out. So I think it's 3 hits for me. Um, it's 3 releases, as I've obviously just spoiled. But it was just slightly more, as I say. I hope the schedule is going to increase. It's going to be up and down. I mean, increase for me is how many discs am I working on. So even if it's a box set, people might say, "Oh, it's only one release." It's like, well, it's 3 times the amount of work for me. So that's where I am sort of juggling that kind of growth over the summer, essentially. But these releases, I'm really pleased with. I mean, I think we've got a bit of a discovery, a classic, and then something that it's gonna be really interesting to see what people make of it, because it's um, not something that's like an established classic, but yeah. But the discs themselves, I'm really really happy with. We're sort of just starting, finishing, um, depending on which one it is. The American ones have to be done like they're practically finished by the time they're announced. So yeah, it's really exciting, and the extras are I'm really 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 pleased with. So yeah, I hope people like them and get excited by them. You know, the more the kind of the big swings I take to get sort of success, the more sort of big swings I'll continue to take, and ultimately that's what I want to do. I don't want to kind of get stuck in this kind of repetition. I think that it's easy to fall into doing stuff from other territories, or um, doing the same thing other people are doing. So yeah, the more unique I can continue to be, the better, hopefully.
Oh, good stuff. Well, I've been excited with every single thing you've announced so far, so I'm sure that this one will be no different. Was there anything you wanted to talk about before we call it a day on this one?
Um, no, not really. No, I can't think of anything. It's just for me, it's just getting the releases out, and just if I want to know anything, I suppose any feedback from the fans is, where are they seeing the reviews? I mean, that's something I'm looking at the moment in terms of deciding on press, and how best to approach that, where people are seeing their reviews, and what they're engaging with the most, and where best I can kind of push review copies and so on, to so people can kind of get their fill, essentially.
Right. Well, thanks very much for joining for this conversation.
Thanks, Edit.
So there we have it. That was my conversation with Fran Simeoni. If you enjoyed this kind of video, then please let me know, because I'll try to do more of these long conversations with people in the industry and perhaps other YouTubers and things like that. If you want to stick around on the channel for more Radiance Films videos, then just click the one that's presented on screen right now, and you can find out more about the very first Radiance releases. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.